Okay, good morning. Bon dia, buenos dias. Thanks for all of you who were already in the previous session, and welcome everybody who is joining us for this one, for this second day of Sónar+D, when we are starting to talk in this morning very much about explorations in time and in space. And I can tell you a little bit of the story or the package story about how we end here. At some point of last summer, I was told by the direction of the festival when we were starting to say, so what are we going to do for the 25th anniversary? Like, well, what is the birthday party? And then they were like, we're going to send music to space, actually to an exoplanet from a radio telescope. We're going to ask a lot of friends of the festival to write music and hope that it will reach an exoplanet in 12.5 years, so that in case that there is some music sent back in response, it arrives right on time for the 50th anniversary of the festival. And I was like, okay. So then how do we start thinking actually about a project like this, about the magnitudes that this encompasses in the context of a festival like Sonar? And when we started thinking about actually how Sónar+D was then think about exploration, what was exploring, both in creative terms, but also in terms of exploring knowledge, obviously we thought we have to learn from the best. We'll have to learn from the people who have been facing these problems or making these questions for a long, long time. And we asked our friend Adam Katz, sitting here, long-time friend of the festival and collaborator, who actually was collaborating with an organization, SETI, which, as you will know, is probably the first organization making this set of questions, and working with people in space agencies like NASA, who have faced the problems of exploration in long distances, identifying other planetary bodies, relating to them, and even better, because this is an arts festival, what would be the role of artists in all of this, if any? So these are really big questions for a Thursday morning, and we have been actually getting ready for them for many months. So it's very, very exciting to finally be in this room with Jon Jenkins, with Lindsay, and with Adam Katz, who has programmed and is going to run this session, thinking about them as messages, distances, and exploration. I remind you again, as I said in the previous session, that the Sonar calling control room, the installation explaining all the dimensions of this project, is opening up at 1. So please go up to see it. You have the whole of rest of the weekend. And thank you so much, Adam, for actually helping us to shape this. And thanks especially Jon and Charles for joining us today. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you, Jose Luis, for having us and for Sonar. I mean, it really is an amazing event that can integrate this kind of conversation alongside the music and the performances and the art. I run a creative agency, but I'm a fan of science and a curator of art and culture and music. And to me, it's always been the primary kind of objective is to dissolve the boundaries between the creative pursuits and the scientific or pursuits, because ultimately these are, communication. It's about listening, which we'll talk about today, and it's about the new forms of knowledge production. And when you think about it in that context, the distinction between the business conference and the performances and the creative work that's happening here, it almost seems less important. So with that, I'll let Charles introduce a little bit about SETI, the SETI Institute, and the work that he's been doing, and then a conversation with Charles and Jon.
Great, thanks, Adam. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Great to see the crowd. And just sort of a shout out to start with, congratulations to Sonar Calling. It's a wonderful operation, and Doug Vakosh, who's the scientist on it, was at the SETI Institute when I first went there, and we're friends. There's a lot of colleagues, Alexander Rose and the Long Now Foundation, if some of you were at the previous talk, give our artists honorary memberships. And while I'm at the Nevada Museum of Art in Reno, which is a great museum, and their Center for Art and Environment are holding our archive and developing it. So all this stuff is happening within a system. So beginning images, I'm going to just tell you a little story about how the program started and basically what we're doing now and the work Jon did there. Top left image, that's the Hyperwall, the Data Visualization Center at NASA Ames. When I first got involved with SETI, there was this access to NASA that was very exciting. And so the image up there, it's actually a European Space Agency image, 8 billion pixel image, sets a little bit of a scale for where we are. It's an area of the night sky as big as the fingernail on your pinky held at arm's length. And so that's driven by a building-sized supercomputer. On the right is the Allen Telescope Array. That's the SETI Institute's telescope. And that picture was just taken 2 weeks ago. I was up there, and I'll tell you a little more about it. So that's where they're listening. You know, sonar calling is METI, it's transmitting signal. This is listening. Bottom right is Kepler data, so that's exoplanets in front of other suns, and that's Jon Jenkins' territory. He's going to tell you a little bit about that. And the bottom left is a sound project that I did when I first got access, and I got permission to use the world's largest wind tunnel for 72 hours, and I put amplifiers in there, and I was actually playing a lot of rainforest recordings. I was thinking about context of sound. So that was thrilling and a little bit ridiculous. My opportunity with the SETI Institute came along because Jill Tarter, the famous astroscientist, portrayed by Jodie Foster famously in Contact, was in New York, and she became aware of some of this work I was doing that's behind me. It's a mixture of a cameraless process, cameraless photographic process and drawing. Jill got very intrigued, and we had a conversation, and Jill, in her generosity, said basically, well, what can I do for you? And I said, you know, you're already doing it. You're an inspiration. She said, you can do better than that. I said, I'd like to visit the observatory. And so she said, great. She said, I'm going to be there in a month. So I went up there. This is actually Jill 2 weeks ago with her husband, Jack Welch, a great astronomer and engineer, and he's actually behind the design of these telescopes. Right now it's an array of 43. It's actually designed to go up to 360 telescopes that are networked to act as a single telescope. So I went up there with Jill, and she was telling me about the SETI Institute. She likes good red wine, as I do, so I took some of that up there, and we're walking under the dishes at night and having the kind of conversations you might have. The Institute is in Mountain View. It's in Silicon Valley. The array is almost at the Oregon border, very northern California. It's radio quiet up there. So she told me about the SETI Institute, and even now, one of the things that people don't know so much about is, I mean, Frank Drake is there, and Seth Shostak, and these great ET scientists, but also the Carl Sagan Center for Study of Life in the Universe is there, so that's astrobiology, and that's kind of a booming field. So there's about 100 scientists there, and their work spans the breadth of astrosciences. So this was just thrilling for me to come into. And so this was some of the work, you know, I went in and I basically got set up to be the beta test. So what happens when an artist goes into this environment? How do we not only gain from it, but perhaps more importantly, what do we give back? You know, how do things work? And so with access to NASA, I did audio work around the D-Wave 2, which is the quantum computer that Google's working with at NASA Ames. And basically, there's a lot of audio nuts, I know, in the audience. Basically, I was recording high-end air conditioning because the processor has to be kept near absolute zero, and the main sound in that recording is a pump that's going at 99 beats per minute. And the engineers refer to that as the monkey running around inside, which is great. So one of the things that's sort of interesting on the right, let's see where we're at, is these were the tanks in the 1990s where the space shuttle models were tested for turbulence. All this is done in software. I was able to put a 3D print of my arm in those tanks and make these works around turbulence, around artworks and my arm, and do some sound work. So it sort of became apparent, and we had the idea that the idea would be that an artist paired with a scientist. I met a lot of the scientists, and they were supportive to a person of the idea. On the right is Dr. Lawrence Doyle, information theorist. He's doing quantum astronomy now. He was one of the first scientists looking for exoplanets, when you could count them on one hand. And so Lawrence and I had a lot of crossover of interests. He applied information theory to humpback whale communications. He proved that humpback whale communications exhibit syntax strongly inferring its language. And in fact, Lawrence just got a Templeton grant to apply information theory to bubble netting, which is fantastic stuff. It's where pods of whales come and they each send their best bubble netter. It's like an all-star team. It's like the Harlem Globetrotters. They come in and they work together to hunt. then they share the fish, and then they take off. So obviously, he was thinking, how can we possibly communicate with aliens if we're not communicating with advanced life forms on Earth that share our own biochemistry? Fabulous science. So here's a couple of these calls. And so these are not the singing they do in mating, but these are actually the hunting calls. So about the same time, I was offered to do a sound installation working with the last operational Morse code facility in the US, which is just north of San Francisco at Bolinas. Bolinas, by the way, named after the baleen of Wales. And so these retired engineers are maintaining this World War II technology. I composed 2 bits of prose. One was, what are the whales saying? The other is, all we need is love. They transmitted and received that. And then so I had the audio of my message. And this gets to this interest in signaling and translation and embedded information. So then I had the audio of that Morse code message. I dropped it into Ableton Live. A lot of you will know about this. It's the DJ software, more than DJs, of course, and converted it to MIDI, the language of electronic instruments, to put it simply. So then I had my message in MIDI. And then I used that MIDI to drive samples of, for example, surf or whale calls, so that prose was driving and therefore embedded in the information. This is what are the whales saying in Morse code. And then this was the installation that I did. This is at MassMocha in Massachusetts. So the one part of it is these 2 cowls that I built. They're shaped like the air intakes on like 20th century freighters on ships. And I knew they would project sound well. They have rear projection video and sound in them. One of the things that was nice that I didn't anticipate was how they project light as well. And you never see the whales. If you put your head in, it really is a surround experience. So people are drawn by the sound and light, and then they go in, and then as you see in a sec, the screen has the rear projection video. You never see whales in the work. You just hear them. But I like this idea, imagine, this sound we all like. You're at the ocean, the waves are crashing. Imagine if there was information in there that we're unaware of. I mean, remember, this is art, not science. It's very speculative. But this territory of imagining what information surrounds us at all times that we're not aware of is very interesting, whether it's pheromonal or whether it's radio or optical signals from space. So with that, my work as sort of the beta test was deemed successful. I organized some lectures and set up some of these relationships I spoke about earlier, and then started to invite other artists. So Jon worked with 3 roboticists that work in the arts from UC Santa Barbara, Danny Bezo, Carl Yerkes, and Marco Pelihan. Incredible guys. He's going to tell you about that in a second. This was in 2016. We had our first group show. Top left is Rachel Sussman. Some of you would know her because she did the photo book, World's Oldest Living Things, where she photographed these all over Earth. And that's a sand mandala, so done in the vernacular of the Tibetan sand mandalas, but of the microwave background. And then, of course, it gets destroyed at the end of the exhibition. And then the bottom left was very interesting artists to work with. Martin Wilner is a practicing psychiatrist and an artist. And he did these interviews. He did 12 scientists, each month a different one, and he would communicate with them every single day and then do these works. Jon, you did one of those with Martin, so you can talk about it. Okay, so quickly, that's where we get to in this position. I'm going to let Jon speak about his work and what it meant for him to work with an artist. One of the premises at the Institute was that for the program to be successful, it had to be as good for the scientist as for the artist. And I think it's fair to say it is. So I'm going to give you that.
Briefly, Charles, just the way that the SETI AIR program functions is partnering one artist with a group of scientists or a scientist from the research center.
Yeah, the artists, right now we have an advisory group of arts curators primarily, and they're keeping an eye, globally at this point on what's going on and then suggesting artists. I mean, we don't have manpower or budget to be fielding calls or anything like that. We're interested in really having a breadth of artists and the type of work they're doing. And then, so they come in, and part of my role is to look at what they're doing, listen to what they're interested in. And at this point, I know most of the scientists, some better than others, but I know her. But so I sort of do this kind of dating thing where I'm suggesting, why don't you have coffee with that scientist or that? And a lot of the scientists at the SETI Institute, particularly in astrobiology and Mars research, they're doing these incredible, they do field work, whether it's in the high Arctic or in the Andes. So in the future, one of the things we're going to be doing is sort of having artists embedded with those projects.
Right, and Jon will talk. I think the assumption is that the artist comes and gets this information that then informs their creative work, but really it's a dialogue, it's an exchange, and the scientists are just as much informed about that creative collaboration.
Yeah, and also we don't, the idea is not that the artist comes to the program knowing what they want to do. I mean, hopefully that discovery happens through the process.
Right, so good morning, everybody. So Alexandra gave a very nice talk and a great introduction to this subject. When we think about looking out in our universe, it's something that we've been pondering for thousands of years, and what I'm going to tell you about this morning is the story of the Kepler mission. And so the Kepler mission was launched in 2009, and its purpose was to determine what fraction of stars have planets like Earth orbiting them in the habitable zone, and that's the range of distances at which a planet would be so that you could have liquid water on the surface of the planet that could be capable of supporting life as we know it. And this is something that we've been pondering for thousands of years. I know that many of you probably, like myself, as a child, lay in the grass in the summer evenings, looking up into the night sky, wondering if there were planets around those stars we were looking at, and whether there were beings like us, or similar enough to us, to look up into their skies in our direction, wondering the same question. And so this is something that we've been wondering about for so long, but it wasn't until about the last 15 or 20 years where we actually had the technology to actually approach this problem and solve it. So we launched this telescope into space, and can we see if the movie works there? Let's see if it clicks. Nope? Okay. At any rate, the idea is to look at the stars and monitor their brightnesses over time. So we take an image every half hour, looking for instances when a planet crosses the face of the star, casting its shadow in our direction, kind of like an eclipse, except that the planet is very small compared to the star. So you're looking for a change in brightness that's 1 part in 10,000 when you're talking about an Earth-sized planet crossing a sun-sized star. So that's a very tiny signature. It's something you can't measure from the ground because of the atmosphere causing the stars to twinkle, so we have to go to space. And of course, you don't know when the star is going to wink at you. You don't know when the planet's going to cross in front of it. So you have to stare at the stars as continuously as possible over time scales that are long compared to the orbital periods that you're interested in. So we launched this mission and observed the stars for 4 years because we were interested in finding planets with 1 year period orbits. So we needed to observe for at least 3 or 4 years to do that. So we observed 100,000 stars, and at the end of 4 years, we found a lot of planets. But 30 years ago, just a few years before sonar got started, this was our picture of all the known planets in the universe. And it was, of course, the 9 planets in our own solar system. So while we believed that there was a good chance, as scientists, that planets would form around other stars, it's a mysterious enough process that we didn't know whether or not there were other planets, and we didn't know whether they were common or whether they were rare. It was quite an open question. But after 4 years of Kepler data, we found over 2,600 planets, and indeed not just single planets around single stars, but we found over 400 planetary systems where you have not one, but in many instances 2, 3, 4, as many as 8 planets orbiting their star, all crossing the face of their star as they do this pirouette about their star. And it's amazing because it told us that this picture we have of how planetary systems form as a consequence of the formation of the star, the planets form at the same time stars form, is true. So this is amazing. You can look up into the night sky and know now that every star you look at has, on average, at least one planet. So now we know that planets indeed are very common, that there are a large number of planets in our galaxy, more planets than there are stars, and that many of them are as small as Earth, and therefore rocky, and that some fraction of those are at a distance from their star that would permit liquid water to pool on the surface. And this is an animation of these multiple transiting planet systems. And so the planets are actually scaled by size to one another, and the orbital sizes are scaled to one another, but of course the planet size is scaled much bigger. But it's fascinating that now we have oraries of hundreds of planetary systems. Sometimes science fiction inspires us and becomes science fact. I know I grew up, I went to Star Wars as a child with my dad and my brothers. And indeed, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, Lawrence Doyle and I were trying to find planets around the smallest known eclipsing binary called CM-DRAC. And we tried to get funding from NASA and from NSF. We tried for 6 years, and we never got funded. Why? Because planets don't form around M stars, these small, cool red dwarfs. How do we know that? We didn't know, but somebody who reviewed our proposal did, or thought they did. Planets don't form around binary stars because they'd be unstable. They won't stay there. You couldn't find them. Well, how do we know? Nobody knew, but somebody thought that they did. So after 6 years, we established lower limits that there were no planets larger than twice the size of Earth transiting the CM-DRAC system. But now in 2011, we were able to, with the Kepler mission, discover the first circumbinary planets like Tatooine. Just like Luke Skywalker, any being on a moon that's orbiting the planets Kepler 16b would look up into their night sky and see 2 sunsets and 2 sunrises every day. And indeed, we found about half a dozen of these systems, like Kepler 35, which actually is a planet that's about 80%, the stars are about 80% the size of the sun. And the planet is about a Saturn-sized planet, but it's a lot lighter. So sometimes science fiction becomes science fact. We don't know until we actually make the measurement. But there's a deep connection. Why am I here? It's because there's a deep connection between sound and music and the science that we do. And so this is the sound and orchestra of solar-like stars. Stars are great big balls of fluid, of plasma, and they resonate like bells. And the larger the star is, the deeper the tone, just like the larger the bell, the lower the pitch. We study the frequencies at which these stars resonate, and what's happening is that you have tremors on the surface caused by turbulence and by the convective activity of the surface layer. And the sound waves travel down through the interior of the star and probe different parts of it. And they have different tones. And if you can measure the frequencies and the frequency spacing of this comb of frequencies, you can measure the mass and the size of the star to a couple %, which is totally awesome because we're not resolving the disk of these stars. They look like pinpoints. They're thousands of light years away. And yet, we can make this very precise measurement using sound, and we can hear the music of the stars, which is very important for us as scientists because it tells us what size the planet is. When we make our measurements of the transits, we are only measuring the relative size of the planet against the size of the star. So the better we know the star, the better we know the planet. Well, my biggest job on Kepler was to define and develop the algorithms that we use to pull out these very weak signatures against the noise of star spots and the instrument and everything else that's going on. And I was inspired by courses I took as an electrical engineering major in audio signal processing. And so what we've built actually is essentially a software version of an equalizer where we separate out the time series, the sound, into into several different band passes where we can analyze the noise power as a function of time and implement an adaptive matched filter that can compensate for the noise to optimally detect the weak signatures of the planets in the data. So I do want to play some sound files for you based on the stars. So when I first started seeing the data that came down from Kepler, it was really amazing. We saw things that nobody had ever seen before. And many of these light curves looked like AM radio stations to me. So I thought to myself, and I asked our principal investigator, what would you think, Bill, if we played these through a sound card? And what if it said, hello, Earthlings? Wouldn't that be a real surprise? Well, we never heard that, although we'd like to. But we were able to make sound files. So let's see if this works. So the thumping you hear is because this is an eclipsing binary, and those are the eclipses. But one of they're in a very tight orbit, and one of the components, one of the stars, is oscillating because of the interactions between the stars. Here's another star that looks very much like an AM radio station where you have amplitude modulation of a frequency. And then this one is a pulsating star that's radially pulsating. So it's getting bigger and smaller with a period of about 12 hours. And then the amplitude modulates. So when I was a kid, I was fortunate to have a grandfather who'd left us his tube radio that had AM and also shortwave stations. And I remember it was quite fascinating as a child to tune through the shortwave and hear all the static and then hear these mysterious voices out there. And so I think part of what drove me to enter this field was to find out, is there a life out there in the universe? And it's something that inspires NASA, inspires ESA. Kepler's opened the door and paved the way, so we have missions like TESS, which just got launched in April, to conduct an all-sky survey for planets that are 10 times closer, and therefore their stars are 100 times brighter, so that we can follow them up. We can measure their masses, and eventually we'll be able to characterize their atmospheres and look for signs of chemistry in their atmospheres that represent biosignatures. So we're going to look for oxygen and for carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor, and chemicals like that that we associate with life. But this work that I did inspired Danny and Marco and Carl to create this installation called SOMNIUM, which is named after a novel that Kepler, the astronomer, wrote. And it was published in 1637 by his son, but it was about a dream of going to the moon. And so they built this installation where they had a glass plate that you can see that was laser etched with the field of view of Kepler. And it's got a microscope that scans over it, and when it passes over a star for which we collected data, they then sonify the data that they pulled off the public archive and make this accessible to visitors of the installation. I think it's a great way to share the mystery and the awe that we as scientists feel as we look out into the universe and try to put ourselves in context with it. So for me at least, there's a deep connection between art and science and music, and we have a responsibility as scientists to share that with the public. And interacting with artists and musicians helps me better understand how to do that. And it's great to see them help us do that work. So I'd like to thank Charlie for getting me involved in all of this in the first place.
Pleasure. Yeah.
It's interesting, just, Charlie, you said something about speculation being the domain of artists, and yet you're talking about science fiction in the way that scientists are using, imagination, creativity, and speculation to premise their research. I'd be interested if you have any insights about how that creative collaboration that happens at SETI AIR, the collaboration between a scientist and an artist, is informed by that process of speculation.
Yeah, sure it is. I've only got a few minutes, so I'm going to have to go back to that one later. But I think what we find is that that's a bigger subject. They're more similar than dissimilar, the artists and scientists, certainly the ones we're putting together. So let me tell you about the project that we just announced. We just announced our latest artist, and it's Felipe Perez Santiago. He is a great composer and musician from Mexico City. I'm thinking a lot of you probably know him. Works with orchestras, electronic musicians. So we just announced his position a month ago, and 2 weeks ago we were up at the observatory because he's going to work with Dr. Jill Tarter on a project called Earthling. It's very ambitious, and we were up there shooting the trailer, the promotional trailer, and basically what I have to show you is sort of the pre-trailer trailer. Nobody's seen this stuff yet. But one of the things he's going to do is field vocal recordings from all over Earth through a social networking app. So this is the pre-trailer trailer of it. So maybe if things go really well, Sonar 2020, we'll see something out of this, maybe. That's it. We could talk forever, as you guys can see. So I don't know if we have time for Q&A or not.
Yeah, I believe there is. Did we want to go to the audience? Are there questions from the audience? Yeah. Okay, yeah.
My sort of like classical understanding of SETI when I was a kid was that you were sitting there listening to, like you were saying, Hello Earthling messages. But what you're talking about there and other things I've seen about SETI, is more about looking for environments that might support life and so might support intelligent life. What's the balance between those two aspects of SETI, or were you never actually listening for Hello Earthling messages at all?
You mean at the SETI Institute, or you mean the field?
Either, generally in the field.
Well, I think it's going from astrobiology, how did life form on Earth, and therefore how might it form elsewhere, to listening to, sort of anticipating that there are complex signals in the noise we don't recognize. I mean, it's the whole breadth of the sciences that are relevant, from what Jon's doing all the way. I mean, that SETI at home was huge, and most people knew it. But the whole breadth is represented there.
But I think what's interesting, actually, you've mentioned it before, what percentage of the research projects that are supported by the SETI Institute are actually SETI projects?
Yeah, okay, if less than 10%. Yeah, at current, current
and it's
rate.
fascinating to learn like Charles is mentioning, the range of different scientific projects that are part of this field of research that is necessary to even kind of comprehend what it would be to have a contact with life on other planets or beyond.
Sure.
And maybe you can just talk about some of the other artists, some of the other science projects and the research that's happening there.
Well, it's the whole range of astroscience. I mean, we know what they are. One of the things that's happening, it's certainly, it's science in the United States, is that all the scientists have to apply for grants. So you have some of the world's greatest minds spending 30% of their working time applying for grants, which seems a bit ridiculous. But I mean, the whole breadth of science, of astrosciences, is represented there all the way.
And what we're trying to do with the SETI Artist in Residence program is create new ways for the general population and people who might not already be familiar with the research happening at the SETI Institute to be introduced to that kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, the point being about funding is it's sort of the fields that are in fashion get more funding, and so it's in many ways that's what determines what gets research. And like Jon said, there's a long history in science of this sort of denial of what might be, and so it's that's problematic. It rises and falls, what's going on. I mean, optical SETI is getting a lot of attention now.
Yep. Just 1 second, I think they...
It seems like there are 3 different objectives. One of them is to make accessible to the average person what you're doing in some ways. Part of it is to give creative stimuli to the artists, And part of it is for the scientists to have another way to actually do research, because what you're describing with the sound, that gave you information to help you further with your research. So are these all three things going on together? Do you kind of negotiate?
I mean, I would say
Yeah.
yes, except for appealing to the average person,
Yeah.
because that's really problematic. I mean, the bar is pretty low in that territory. But sorry, a little bit cynical. But seriously, it's contemporary art. It's not illustration.
Yeah.
It's something else.
Yeah.
It's intended to be something else. It's supposed to be very experimental. And I feel like the program and the art that we're encouraging is just getting going. I mean, it's really just getting going. One of the interesting things that I found working with the scientists, being around them, befriending them, is almost to a person, the scientists have no knowledge of contemporary art. I mean, their knowledge of art stops at like Picasso, if we're lucky. They sort of know who Warhol is. And that really brings up a question of, why is that? Is it their bandwidth is full? Is it that the arts isn't delivering something they need? A lot of them are science fiction, avid science fiction readers. It sort of makes me wonder what is, I mean, it's a big umbrella, but what is contemporary art not delivering somehow, or why are they not aware of it? It's curious that it's so siloed.
And yet, most of them are musicians or huge fans of music.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
We should
Jon's
bring
talked-
more of them to Sonar is
Right.
what we should do. But
Jon, maybe you can just mention a little bit about your interest in music, a background in music, and how that might have informed kind of your profession as a scientist.
Well, I mean, like most kids, I was encouraged to join the band, so I played trombone. When I was much younger, in third grade, I had a Sunday school teacher who played harmonica and invited us to learn harmonica. So I learned harmonica in third grade, and I played that up through college, and played trombone through college. And then I picked up the ukulele shortly before Kepler launched, because Wikipedia said it was the easiest instrument in the world to learn how to play. And I think Wikipedia had it wrong. It's really hard to master. It's easy to pick up and learn some things. But music engages your mind in multiple levels and multiple textures and ways that I think really represent what you feel as you're creating music or interpreting music is the same kind of feeling that I have when I'm solving a technical problem, a challenging problem. That it requires abstract reasoning that in some sense can't be easily communicated. That's visual and sensual in the sense of perception. You often draw a picture or have some kind of visualization before you actually write down any equations. The equations come after you visualize the problem.
Well, I think, if I may interrupt, I think one of the great things about Sonar Calling is sending out music to represent us instead of sort of sending out the Super Bowl advertisements or something into space. We're sending music. It's a wonderful idea that could represent us. Mm-hmm. Right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, and the insight we have as artists and fans of music and attendees at a conference like this is that these are kind of universal truths that then give us access to some of the scientific work. So,
Yeah.
do we have time? Is there another question from the audience? Oh, sure.
I just wanted to find out what happens what's the protocol when you actually hear something?
I mean, there is the SETI Institute and leaders in that field have met with all the great religious leaders, from the Dalai Lama to the Pope, and there is actually there is a protocol. I mean, people ask, have you ever heard anything? As soon as anything's known, everybody on Earth is going to know. There's no secret keeping. And the only people that are threatened by the idea of the discovery life beyond us are fundamentalists, fundamental religions. The Mormons have already figured out how to take the message and go, oh yeah, our brothers and sisters, we knew it all along, So I think, there has been lots of formal meetings that way. I mean, there is a protocol, but there's no keeping that secret. Now, what's interesting is, China just started operating fast. It's the largest radio telescope. It occupies a valley, and so I'm not sure what their approach would be if the Chinese Space Agency happens to receive the message first. But the idea is that when a message is received, all the telescopes get moved away, and then they get moved back, so it's not to make sure it's not a false. And what would happen is they all communicate to start pointing all the radio telescopes at Earth at that target to verify it. So yeah, there's very clear protocols.
That's right. So it includes verification, sharing information with other SETI researchers to verify, confirm the finding, and then to share that with governments and with the world, because that information belongs to all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you guys, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks to the audience. Thanks everybody here.